Hello and welcome to Transforming Tomorrow, the podcast from the Pentland Centre for Sustainability and Business. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jane Babington.
What does the future look like? What did lockdown teach us about the environment? And what does that mean for us in a world that's back to being busy? Welcome to the Anthropocene. Jan, I want to take a trip back to the Anthropocene.
Well, I think you're in the Anthropocene, to be fair, but...
Or am I?
Well, yes, that's a very good question.
I remember the discussion we had with Henrik Osterblom from the Anthropocene Laboratory at the Swedish Academy of Sciences not too long ago, and the discussion there deciding whether scientists can even agree if we are in the Anthropocene or not, and what the Anthropocene is if we are in it.
Indeed, and so natural scientists have a very clear idea, but also organisational and other social scientists have as well.
Should we explain what the Anthropocene is? Because there might be people listening to this who haven't heard our talk about Anthropocene before.
So the Anthropocene is a way of thinking about the current point in time as being a really significant and different ecological space than what we've occupied before. It's where humans become the main driving forces of a lot of Earth system processes, whether that be climate change, biodiversity loss, material flows, etc. And if we are living in the Anthropocene, then that raises questions about the agency of people individually, but collectively within countries, but also collectively within corporations. So it's potentially a game changer in how we think about responsibility for what's happening around us, but who has that responsibility and how is it made?
There you go. You did a good job considering you weren't expecting to have to define the subject.
Thank you for that, Paul. We'll find out what our guest made of that.
And we're also going to be discussing public and private sector and how they intersect and how that touches upon sustainability as well, because we've talked at times about private corporations, we talked at times about government. It's good to maybe see how everything comes together, public, private.
Indeed, but if we're trying to change everything around us, then a partnership between the public and the private sector is going to be much more productive than these two sectors working in isolation.
I'm not going to ask you to define any more things. I will introduce our guest. Yes, let's bring our guest in. Because today we are joined by a man who has a job title that as a child, I think, yeah, that sounds like a good job. It's Dr. Martin Quinn, who is a reader in the Department of Organisation, Work and Technology. Martin, do you just spend all your day reading?
Oh, I'd love to, yeah. Yeah.
I get the feeling, though, that the job title isn't as good as childhood me would like to imagine.
I have to admit the job title is quite, I do quite enjoy it. I think there are some of the old academic job titles that are rather fun, and I quite like the title reader. And I particularly like the fact that my department, when you put it down to its acronym, means that I'm a reader in out.
Which, given the northernness of both of us, as we discussed before we started recording, it's a word that we use quite a lot. Now, taken out, Jan.
Yes.
You almost then tried to do a northern accent, didn't you? I think you stopped yourself.
I was going to say I, because I spent so long in Scotland, then I thought people would think I was just making it up. So
No, we say aye. Aye. Of course we do, aye.
Okay. Yeah. There we are, we're on the same page.
We're not here, though, to discuss regional dialects of Scotland, England and New Zealand. We are here to discuss the areas of public-private sector intersections and the Anthropocene. Let's start with the first of those, Martin. Can you describe the work that you do, focusing on that intersection between the public and private sectors, and particularly in regard to developing the economy?
Yeah, sure thing. So my work or research has always kind of looked at the points at which the public and private sectors kind of meet, with an eye on how do places, I'm particularly interested in place, how do places come to be? How do they develop? How do they produce a kind of identity, a sense of place? And how do they grow? Although that last one has increasingly been a question for me of, is that actually an appropriate way of looking at things? How do they grow? And the more work I've been doing in the past few years and the more opportunities I've had to work with a variety of different people, that question's actually been more about how do places interact both with the people but also the environment that they're in.
I thought we were about to get into a discussion about growth and degrowth then, to harken back to one of our very first episodes with Duncan Pollard on such things.
And also Steve Kempster and good dividends as well.
Yes, that's right. I'd forgotten about Steve. He discussed it very much in that concept of good dividends, didn't he?
So we should tuck that to our sort of intellectual headspace as we go forward with this one. So you talked about public and private meeting in places. So let's sort of unpeel that a little bit. So what characterises the public and the private sectors, and where do they meet, and why are people interested in those distinctions?
I mean, to some degree, they're blurred. The boundaries between the two are blurry. However, I think they have different remits and different purposes to a degree within an economy or within a place. You could take a very basic definition of the private sector, which is simply that it's there to make money, and that it makes money by extracting value from resource, whether that's humans or whether that's natural resources or whether it's manufacturing something and selling it, whether it's offering a service, whatever that might be. But ultimately, the purpose is to turn that into a profit-making enterprise. The public sector has a much broader remit, has a remit of ensuring that services run, that there is infrastructure in place. That I think in our version of economies here in the West, in the UK, is that then those private sector organisations can operate as freely as possible and make that profit. Now, there's interplay between the two. There's been increasing blurring, as I said, of the boundaries between the two, where some tasks that the public sector would previously have done are now done by the private sector. However, if you take a longer view of that, those were tasks that were originally done by the private sector that then became public sector tasks that have then moved back into this kind of middle ground of some elements of them being done by the private sector, some by the public. That can be things like energy, that can be things like transport, health, education, any aspect of life, really.
It's a big political issue, obviously, as well as an environmental issue when it comes to public and private. You've got certain wings of certain parties want to privatise everything. Certain wings of certain parties want to bring everything back into public ownership. It's a discussion that you see going on all the time across loads of geographies, including here in the UK, when it comes to, say, trains or the National Health Service. You see it in America when it comes to whether they want to decentralise government. They're the two examples that I can think of off the top of my head because they're the ones that are most in our media. But you see it a lot, don't you, about how they work individually as private and public, but also how they might work together.
Yeah, indeed. And I guess, part of that kind of some of the political debate that you referred to, sometimes seen as what's called hollowing out of the state, so taking some of the functions of the state and handing them to the private sector. Now, there are different ways of looking at that. There's some really interesting work coming out of UCL in London, Mariana Mazzucato's work on innovation and public innovation and entrepreneurship. And some of the arguments there are actually what's happened is we've taken the potentially profit-making part of the public and handed it back to the private. So it's a way of handing public money to the private sector. That's obviously a very particular take on that. But you can see transport for that. So the public sector retains the responsibility for the track, whereas the private sector run the trains on that, where you can sell tickets and you can make your money. So that's one of the ways I think that's playing out.
And in this context, we often hear the phrase public value. And so that must have a particular meaning within this debate. So could you say something about that?
Yeah, so public value is... I think it's a really interesting concept and a really interesting idea, but it is by its very nature quite a messy one. So we think about, well, how do we produce value for the public as at a very basic level? Well, one way of doing that is to ensure that there are plenty of jobs, because then people can earn money and buy their houses and pay for sustenance and also consumer goods. That's one way of producing public value and public good. And in that, we can see how the private sector has a very large role to play, because bringing in a large private sector operator potentially produces a lot of employment in an area. There's also then a broader notion of, well, okay, how do we make sure that that value is spread as widely as possible? And I guess that's where the public then comes back into that discussion. And I think in terms of some of that interplay between public and private that's been mentioned, what I want to think, some of the questions I'm interested in terms of governance of this is, what is the role of the public sector in helping the private sector to thrive and flourish? But also, what are the responsibilities of the private sector in making sure that the public sector has the wherewithal to do that? And that's not just about finance, that's also about expertise, and it's about support. because a lot of the time lending credibility to a major project really helps the public sector to see something through. And I think you can think about something like HS2, which perhaps never really gained traction, whereas something like the Eden project in Morecambe, which has a lot of business support, that then allows the public sector to talk about it more broadly, because they can say, we've got the private sector on board, we've got our local businesses on board. And I think we see that, really good examples of that in lots of different places. So all the research I've done, I've seen examples of that as well.
Call me a cynic, and I know I've been accused of that many times on this particular podcast, but when it comes to private sector involvement, surely they don't care what happens with the public sector, they just want to make money. So therefore, the public value of it is irrelevant to them as long as they roll in lots of dosh for their company.
Well, as I say, I mean, ultimately, if you take the very base level kind of definition of what is private, absolutely, you know, the private sector's job is to make money. Obviously, it's made to make profit. It's to make sure that they can turn whatever their ideas are, whatever their resources are, into profit. However, I think we're probably going to come on to different definitions of the public value and how we might define public value differently. It is in the interests of the private sector to have a strong economy. It's not really in the interest of a private organisation to simply go it alone. You know, some private organisations are obviously huge and effectively as big as a state, but even then they have to interplay with others. They have to have a regulatory framework which allows them to operate. They have to have access to skilled labour. They have to have access to skilled labour that can easily access the jobs that they're offering. Now, in order for, an organisation can't do that on its own. A private organisation cannot do that on its own. So they actually do need the public sector in that way. They need the public sector to be providing healthy, educated workforce who can easily access and get to the site where that work is being done. So they do need it. I mean, and all of those things then enhance the profit line. So, yeah, you can take a view of, well, all we're interested in is making profit. Okay, that's fine. But in order to make that profit and to maximise that profit, you need these tasks doing, and there's a cost to that. But the benefit of that cost outweighs not working with the public sector at all, I would argue.
So you don't see us being in the kind of cyberpunk dystopian future whereby corporations are just running the whole world and running all governments and everything?
But even if corporations did that, they would still have to think about that infrastructure and those services. So, yeah, there's still going to be a cost to that. So if they were running it themselves entirely, there may be little bits and bobs that they took out of that. But ultimately, they need the resources they need aren't simply about the natural resources. It's all about the human resource as well.
What I liked about how you described that is that comes together in a place. And I know in your work you also use a fantastic phrase of anchor institution. And it might be a new phrase to some of our listeners. So I'd like you to run us through what is an anchor institution in the first instance, and then we'll ask you some more questions about these things once you get going.
So the idea of an anchor institution is generally a large institution or organisation. I'm going to keep using those words interchangeably, I suspect. That anchors a place, that acts as a kind of a source that the rest of the economy can kind of spark off and bounce off and grow off. Now, they can take different forms. They can be a big private sector organisation. Now, in the past, in the UK, we would be thinking about manufacturing probably there. We would be thinking about, say, steel in South Yorkshire, the mining industry, big manufacturing. For a town like Morecambe or some of the coastal towns, you'd be thinking about tourism as an anchor institution. You might think about the shipping industry as well. But what they do is they provide a massive employment. They provide a reason for the town being there in the first place in some instances. Without clay, would Stoke-on-Trent be there, for example? No offence to Stoke-on-Trent meant by that, but it's the cities and towns tend to have sprung up initially around a resource, and that resource then turned itself into an industry, or was turned into an industry. It's giving it perhaps too much agency to say it turned itself. And it's around those industries then. But if you think about, so let's take the coal mine in the village that I grew up in, that acts as an anchor for the whole town of Goulburn, where I grew up. Now, the colliery in Goulburn would have employed 800 to 1,000 people. But the other businesses that spring up around that to service that one large employer include the supply chain for food, it includes the clothing, it includes everything around it. But also off that, you get things like the community centres. You get a reason for going to school because you need the job. So the schools spring up around, you get all the services that then service the population. We can look at Lancaster as an example as well. The initial anchor institution would have been the castle, and everything kind of grows around the castle. You then move, say, from the castle to the port, and the port then being the reason that the town grows. Now, and not everything in Lancaster is to do with the port, but people need to eat. People need housing. People need, again, employment, education, health. Now you might view a public sector organisation as an anchor. So the university might now be seen as an anchor. Perhaps controversially for some people in the town to see this university as an anchor, but I think it does act as that when you look at the amount of employment it brings, but also then the spend in the town of the student body. And again, to go to Morecambe and to Eden, if Eden comes in, Eden could potentially be the anchor that everything else then kind of sparks off.
I think certainly the first time I heard the term anchor institution was in relation to us as a university, and you hear it mentioned within these walls. I think because it's very much a term that you wouldn't necessarily hear the general public use that much, but even though the concept stands, but you do hear it a lot within the walls of the university, people seeing us as an anchor institution, and not just the benefits that come out, but the responsibility for us as an anchor institution of how we act, the impact that we have on the area. So there's much more to being an anchor institution than just being there and having other stuff spin off you. It's how you behave and what goes on.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's a really important point, actually, the kind of responsibilities that come with being that anchor institution. Now, we've sometimes seen examples of regional development and place development where towns and governance structures have decided what we need to do is attract an anchor tenant. So in Birmingham, for the Bull Ring, it was John Lewis. In other places, you've seen them try and attract, so Nottingham brought in Capital One, for example, to try and say, look, we've got this big organisation, so the rest of you want to be here as well. What then relies on is that organisation staying around, but also then actually taking a lead in the governance of that place. And you've seen it in some places where it's worked. So again, you think about the coal mines, they didn't just extract coal. They also put in place community centres and helped to build the schools. I mean, that's perhaps going back to Victorian values of places like Saltaire and Ellesmere Port and Port Sunlight. But I think that's also true in more modern times of, so John Lewis going into places like Birmingham, but also into Leicester, as an example, and then working with the local FE colleges to put on courses that allow people who are coming out of the dyeing textiles industry to then gain retail qualifications to go and work in that. So they take that kind of lead role within their economy and within their governance structure. To go back to one of the points you made, that then allows them to maximise their profit because they're working with the local structure to make sure that it's supplying them the labour they need. Obviously, there are different requirements, I guess, from anchor institutions that come from the public sector. But yeah, the university has a massive role to play, and not just in Lancaster, but in any town, in terms of its position in the economy and in the ecosystem of that economy, and how it then works with the businesses. So any small business in a town or a city with a university should be able to go and work with that university, should be able to go and say, look, we've got this particular problem. It might be graduates that they need. It might actually be the research that's being done. You know, how can we spark off that research?
I can see this in my hometown as well, spread across 150, 200 years. So Barrow-in-Furness wasn't really much of an anything until iron. On the back of iron came steel. On the back of steel came shipbuilding. When the shipbuilding came, they started to build a place called Vickerstown on Walney Island. Anyone who's a fan of Thomas the Tank Engine may know the island of Sodor and Vickerstown, spelt as in a vicar in a church. That's named after Vickerstown, spelt as in the old shipbuilding company Vickers on Walney Island. And Walney Island is essentially Sodor. So I grew up on Sodor, Jan. That's an interesting fact for you. But going beyond that, so you have the yard building that. There were schools built. There were hospitals built. Then coming to the present day, the University of Cumbria is now building an engineering campus that is going to be tied in with the shipyard because they need the engineering graduates and the engineering expertise, apprenticeships and everything. So yeah, you can see there how, as an anchor institution, iron, steel, shipbuilding has been in place for almost 200 years in the town, and the town just would not be there in anywhere near its current form. It'd still be a lot of little farms patched about an old ruin of an abbey if it wasn't for that industry being there.
Absolutely. And if you think about that, it's then incumbent on those anchor institutions of steel and shipbuilding to ensure that the people who are taking those jobs have houses, that their families have something to do. They can access food, so it's important to build the infrastructure to bring the shops in. Otherwise, yeah, they'd want to build a ship there, but they wouldn't be able to do it.
This is a concept as well that I first came across, and it just reminded me when you said about John Lewis in geography lessons at senior school. And we didn't talk about anchor institutions, but you talked about essentially a magnet store. So if you had a big shop like Marks and Spencer's, Debenhams, you talked about John Lewis in a town centre, then other businesses want to be in that town centre. And that's an example from a retail perspective of that one institution there. But this is a whole bigger thing for a wider community.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, another term for it would be flagship. And it attracts, it makes it a place that other businesses want to move to. You think about the number of startup and tech companies around Oxford and Cambridge and the Oxford-Cambridge arc. That's because of those two huge anchor institutions in the universities that have been there for that long. And it's like, well, if I need access to skills, if I need access to knowledge, the latest innovations, this is where I need to be as a tech company. To go back to where I used to live in Leicester, that's exactly the same thing there. The council worked with the university and worked with some of the key businesses in the town to set up what was known as the Creative Business Depot. That creates a whole culture of startups, and now people are moving out of London to work in that area because it's the place to go if you want to make that business work.
So this is where we're going to have to limber up, and I'm going to be judged as whether or not I knew what the Anthropocene was.
Just your physical gesture there suggested you're actually going to do some limbo dancing.
No,
I don't know if you're...
Just get ready. So all of that is a huge area of discussion, depth of expertise, huge amount of sophistication in that area. Then you take that area and twin it with the Anthropocene. I mean, I know you're heroic. so how have you developed those ideas within the context of the Anthropocene? And perhaps we ought to start off with you marking my homework and whether or not I knew what the Anthropocene was on the spot as well.
Yeah, you did very well, I think.
Oh, thank you.
Damn it.
No, I mean, this is where my homework might be marked as well.
Sure.
I think for me, I was working on the issues that we've been talking about already, and then I was in a fortunate position that the department I was in at the time had a number of fascinating people who were trying to apply all these ideas and concepts across different challenges. One of them was, how do you spark innovation in the economy? One was, how do we deal with the graduate brain drain from most cities in the UK? And then another one was around, we have this environmental crisis on our doorstep. The university I was at previously, we were lucky enough to have in the geology department some of the leading figures on the science behind the concept and the idea of the Anthropocene. So in terms of defining the Anthropocene, I would always, in anything I do, defer to my friends and colleagues from geology. But I guess my understanding basically is that the Anthropocene is the point at which change in the ecosystem, in the Earth system, as you said earlier, is demonstrably influenced by human activity for the first time. So it's humans that are changing the climate. It's humans that are changing the ecosystem. While that's been going on for a period of time, 100, 150 years, depending on your point of view, that's accelerated since the early 1950s. with the amount of activity and the sheer number of humans that are now on the planet. And to then apply that to some of the kind of concepts and ideas I worked with previously, say cities and places. You think about a city, you think about a place, and as I think I said earlier, cities and places tended to spring up around an area that was livable, where there was a natural resource, whether that was a river, whether that was arable land, or something like minerals in the ground. As soon as we get a collection of humans, we tend to then start to overuse our resources, and then we have to bring food in. But we've hit a point with the scale and size of cities that's then having a hugely detrimental effect on the local environment. Now, at that point, that becomes a challenge for governance and for the economy of those cities and places, because if it's suddenly costing much more to extract your minerals or to bring your labour in, if it's not a pleasant place to live and people are moving out, then you're faced with a challenge. To go back to the profitability argument, you're faced with that challenge. So it becomes a live challenge for everyone. And I think that's one of the reasons I got kind of interested in it and involved in the group that I did at the time, which was great fun to be involved in those discussions, by the way. And yeah, so it kind of sparked from there.
And that sort of thinking about the livability then comes back to that conversation we just had about, you know, public value, public and private sector working together in place. But I'm just going to do a wee aside here, if I may. So it's I mean, some of the geologists you're working with are the core people in the stratigraphy community who got to name and to interrogate and to understand the Anthropocene. What's been your experience of working with, you know, natural scientists of this kind of calibre, but also natural scientists that are so embedded in the geology, whereas, you know, you've got coming from a completely different discipline?
Yeah, it's been fascinating. It's been a wonderful opportunity. Mark and Jan, who are the two main guys that we work with from geology, they've been brilliant to work with. It's been, I think, a really good collaboration, because what we basically had was a group of people who were working in a management school, who were from a range of different disciplines within that, and social science disciplines, who were interested in the applicability of what we were doing beyond merely a business. So we were already looking at you know, what happens outside of this? How does this impact on society? And then we'd started looking at the environment and looking at the climate crisis. And as it happened at the same university, we had these people in the geology department who were working on the very idea of the Anthropocene, the very concept of when it started, when it should be classified as having started. And they were looking at questions of, well, okay, we know the science, but how do we then get it into the public debate, into the public discourse? How do we make it an issue for organisations? And you have that, I think, issue that, you know, universities do an awful lot of amazing detailed work in different disciplines, but often we're working in silos. But it can't be that management schools and business schools simply create a group of students who understand, or graduates rather, who understand consumption and production and who understand how the economy works, but don't understand how that relates to the environment. Equally, you can't really just simply produce a group of science graduates who understand in enormous depth and detail the damage that's been done to the Earth system, but don't know how to deal with organisations or manage that knowledge. Why has it not been done before? Perhaps should be the question, rather than how's it working. It's great. You know, one of the joys of the job that I think we do is we work with people with inquisitive minds, and providing we can kind of step aside from the politics of higher education, I think there are enormous opportunities there. So it's been brilliant to work with them. Now, obviously, they have the work that they do that goes into the natural science journals and is based on you know, the very hard scientific data. And then they come along and they work with us with our more philosophical, ethnographical bents. And they find that fascinating and interesting and different. And we find the way they approach data fascinating and different, but it's been brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Good. And that has been my experience as well.
Yeah.
And you're really superb, curious natural scientists are a joy to work with.
Yeah.
And how is this then? How is your work around the Anthropocene shaped how you think about public value?
Well, I think what it's done is it sparked a conversation about actually what is public value. There were kind of two core questions within the public value debate. One is, who is it valuable to do things for? So who are the public? And the second one is, what is it then valuable to do for that public? And I think for us, we started playing around with that first one. Who is it valuable to do things for? Who is the public? Now, if you think about the public in terms of the general population as one aspect of that, and institutions and organisations, so universities, religious groups, towns, organisations, businesses, private organisations, then we can see that there are certain things in the economy that are valuable to do for that group, that don't harm the people in that group. There's a question of who and what gets left out. So it's valuable, if we have that definition, to produce the conditions which allow a mine to open and to extract coal because it's creating employment. That's valuable for the public. What we started to do is to push that question of who should be considered in terms of who is it valuable to do things for. And I think what our thinking then started to do was say, well, if in the Anthropocene, if we just carry on with that narrow definition of who it is valuable to do things for, we don't change anything. Because actually extracting the maximum amount of resource for the maximum amount of profit is absolutely the right thing to do if we take that narrow definition of who it is valuable to do things for. If we broaden that out to the town itself, the earth system, the ecosystem, to plant life, to animals, at that point you're asking different questions then in terms of what is it valuable to do. Because pure extraction of materials and natural resources is actually no longer valuable when taken from the point of view of a new constituent within that public, if that makes sense.
It sounds to me a bit similar to the conversation we had with Camillo on when we talked about environmental law and giving a voice to the planet, so that something that doesn't have the ability to vocalise what it wants, like we do as people, still is represented. Because like you say, you need to consider the effects on the town, on the surrounding area. You need to consider the effects on the whole planet. And therefore, this concept of public value needs not just to consider the public as people, but to consider everything around them and to make sure that has a say in what happens then.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even within that, we have to acknowledge that in what we've tried to do in terms of expanding that question of who and giving voice to the environment and to the ecosystem and the earth system, that's still a very human-centric view and point of view. It is our interpretation of what the planet might like. Now, sometimes you'll hear people argue what we're trying to do is save the planet. We're not, are we? What we're actually trying to do is make sure it's still habitable for us. We're trying to save ourselves, really. It's still a very human-centric lens on this. But yeah, we thought, and what we've argued in our work has been that if you consider the impact on the environment as part of that question of value, that actually you come up with some different answers when it comes to how do you produce value. Because you have to make sure that in producing value, you're not damaging one of your constituent parts of your public.
So I think in some ways the questions of who, what and how are really important, but also not fully realised because we are in the midst of environmental breakdown and the Anthropocene crisis of all sorts. So I wonder if you've got an example from your work, and here I'm thinking about the work that you did thinking about what life looked like during lockdown, that might be able to provide us with a sketch of the who, what and the how and what that different world might look like, because we are trying to imagine something that we're not currently seeing.
Yeah. And I think it is it's a challenge, and it's a challenge that's been thrown at us whenever we've presented the work, of course, is actually, this is all lovely and it's a very nice idea, but practically, how do we do this? Because people need jobs. People need cash in their pocket to be able to live their lives. So we can't just stop. We can't just turn everything off. But actually, one of the things that we then started to think about, I mean, it was sparked by experiences of the lockdown. The lockdown actually offered us, I think, some pretty stark lessons. You know, within a matter of weeks of the lockdown starting, the skies were clear. In some of the work we've been doing, we looked at the city of Venice, and one of our papers, we start with a walk in Venice, and it's during lockdown. And I say we didn't all walk in Venice because there was only one of the team, the lead author, was actually in Venice at that point, and she lived there. So the images we got from Venice at that time were of a city of beauty, a city where you could hear wildlife, where the canal was blue. Can you imagine such a thing if you've been to Venice? The canals were blue, they weren't smelly, they weren't full of rubbish. You could actually see the buildings because the city wasn't simply full of tourists. The issues of Venice sinking, you know, that started to correct itself. Now, of course, it's all gone back. But what you see in that area is all of a sudden, now hang on a minute, if there's a way of limiting this, if there's a way of thinking differently about how we move people around, about our activity, about the amount of activity we do, look how quickly the environment reacts and responds to a lack of pollution. We finished the paper with an apocalyptic walk, which is nothing changes and actually things get worse and Venice has exploded, because we like to be creative.
I was really worried he was going to go back to Stoke-on-Trent there, because he was a bit offensive towards Stoke-on-Trent before, was Martin. And I thought,
Well, he actually wasn't, but I think you're being mischievous. And that kind of makes me think about the Ministry for the Future, which is quite a well-known book, which I had a go at reading, but I found I couldn't get past chapter 2 on the trauma scale, but I should maybe go back and have a think about it, where, if you like, they were motivating that thinking about articulating what the world could look like, what a place could look like. And I suppose, given we're all connected to places and settled into places, actually that's a really powerful way to articulate what a better and a worse future might look like.
No, indeed. And I think, we probably all experienced elements of that during lockdown ourselves, didn't we, in terms of what happened around us. I believe, to go back to Morecambe, the promenade of Morecambe was one of the busiest places in the UK during lockdown, because we actually took advantage of nature. We actually went and walked.
Yeah.
We slowed down and we walked. And maybe slowing down's the thing to do. You see a place and you experience a place, whether that's a city or whether it's the countryside, completely differently when you walk it. You suddenly actually appreciate what's going on at street level. And maybe one of the lessons is more walking. Yes. It's better for your health, it's better for the environment.
And I was locked down in Birmingham, just up by the university. Owls. There were tons and tons of owls that I don't think any of us knew were living there, but when it was quiet, you could hear them, which was quite amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So just to wrap it up then, Martin, what are you taking from all your work that's inspirational to you, that's providing you with hope for the future?
Hope?
I was worried then that he'd misled that concept of hope. Please tell us, Martin, that the concept of hope is in there somewhere.
I mean, actually, that is a concept that some of my colleagues are playing around with. Marta Gasparini, who's the lead author on that paper, is actually playing around with the idea of consolation rather than hope in the Anthropocene, and I think that's something to perhaps keep an eye on. I think hope is that we've seen how quickly we can actually make an impact, and I think hope is that an anchor institution like Eden might offer a different way of developing a place. So, for Morecambe as a town which has seen a series of declines in the past 20, 30, maybe even 40 years, a project like Eden might well offer hope, because it's an environmentally focused project that should produce public value in terms as how we might once have understood public value, in terms of employment, in terms of developing the education system in the town, attracting people to the town, but attracting people to the town in an environmentally sustainable way, and to actually come and learn about the environment and to interact with their environment. So maybe there's some hope there that we might think about how an anchor institution should have as one of its focuses its interaction with the environment and lead on that. And maybe Lancaster University with its energy development, maybe that's another example of an anchor institution taking a lead. So maybe there's some hope there as well. And the more that those kind of things happen, perhaps the more that then cascades down through the rest of the economy and rest of society.
There is hope. It's not all gone, Jan. It's not all gone. Martin, thank you very much for this conversation. It's been great.
Thank you for having me.
Well, do you feel consoled, Paul? Because hopeful's not really your thing, but consolation, that was, I don't know, but I feel unavoidably sad just now.
I like to believe in hope as a concept, though, and that pretty much left the room halfway through that conversation. It's like hope no longer exists, accept consolation, that you're not dead, essentially, was the message there. So, yeah.
Well, I suppose, and there is a light-hearted edge to this podcast, but this is one of the topics which actually is pretty dark and serious, really.
It didn't necessarily start off that way. We were talking about public and private, and we were talking about the differences between them, what the idea of public value. You know, my cynicism obviously came out with the regards to the private sector and whether they'd do anything if there wasn't money in it for them. But yeah, then we went to the Anthropocene and suddenly a big cloud came over the room and everything was darkness and death was all around us. And yeah.
However, there were some bright sparks. I promise you there's some bright sparks here if we think about them. I think two that really sparkled for me. The first one is the sense of agency that we might have of members of Lancaster University, that as an anchor institution, that we with the right leadership and so many, a good following wind, all sorts of things could come together, and for the institution itself to actually create public value, to nurture public value, and to be part of this conversation between who, what, and how.
Yeah, I think the idea of responsible anchor institutions, those that aren't just there, but recognise the role that they have because they are there, and the responsibilities they have to the communities and the world all around them is a particularly key element that needs to be considered. There will be some anchor institutions that don't have that same positivity and attitude, that are just there. Martin gave the example of you could just mine coal because it's good for the people who work there, and you could carry on doing that until the coal ran out just because it's good for giving people employment and a job. But that concept now just doesn't hold water because there's far bigger considerations to be made. And
in some ways, and I know we shouldn't hark back to prior ages being straightforwardly good, but some of the Victorian sensibilities and some of the sensibilities around New Larnac, around Port Sunlight, some of the Cadbury, the Bourneful estate in Birmingham, some of these ideas were actually about a larger sense of being an anchor institution and public value that comes from it. So we maybe squeezed it out in the meantime, but maybe these circumstances in the Anthropocene bring those elements back into the conversation.
Because we were talking about the Anthropocene and you talked about harking back to previous ages, I thought you were going to go back to something like the Jurassic period or the Triassic period and sort of say, I wonder what the dinosaurs of those times thought about it. I'm sure not everything was rosy for them. I know if you were being eaten by a carnivore, then I'm sure it wasn't. But yeah, I know exactly what you're saying, that harking back to old times isn't always brilliant. You can look for anything with rose-tinted spectacles, but there are ideas there and you see concepts there that on how they worked and how they developed, and see positivity in that.
And the second bright spark then, which almost takes some of those ideas into a more current time, is that link to Eden. And listeners who have listened to a few of our podcasts would have heard Eden come up quite often. We've had the Morecambe Bay curriculum folk on to talk about that work, and Eden Morecambe Bay is, it's been consented. A lot of funding's been assembled around it, and there's a general expectation that it will come through and be part of the broader place landscape here. But there's a lot of hopes for that institution as well, and the desire for that to not be a game changer on its own, but with these other partners to actually create something quite special.
Yeah, a lot of weight gets put on it. If it was to fail, then everyone would go, oh, God, we were putting all of our hopes on that almost. There's a whole lot of weight around it and stuff. I want to go back to something, though, Jan. You made a very good joke during the episode, and I don't think you even realised you'd made it.
Probably not.
We were talking about the value of multidisciplinarity, about working with colleagues across different areas, and how Martin works with different people in different areas and with the geologists. And that such a great concept, and the fact that you can bounce off each other and learn, just as you have with the CBOS project and with the various biologists, marine biologists and other people who you work with on that. And you call geologists core people, and I just immediately thought, well done, Jan, that's great. I don't think that's what you meant to say, or meant the joke rather, but well done.
Thank you. Yes, that was unintentional, but really quite sweet. I agree.
So next time, I'm afraid we don't have any geologists for you.
Oh, well, what have we got?
Yeah.
I'm sure we've got someone equally as good.
Well, we're going to be going to India, and we're going to be talking to Biraj Patnaik, who is the Executive Director of the National Foundation for India, an organisation that works a lot to end food inequality in the country.
And I think there's a really nice link across to the Ministry for the Future, which is a book that we'll put on as a resource on the bottom of this podcast. Is that part of that is set in India, and a future India that looks really scary.
Let's hope that the India that Biraj envisages isn't quite so scary.
I think that will be the case. I look forward to it.
Indeed. Until then, thank you very much for listening. I'm Paul Turner.
And I'm Professor Jane Babington.